The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, folded inside an envelope with the Pinnacle Systems logo embossed in navy blue on the upper left corner, and Marcus Webb read it standing in the hallway of his apartment building in Fort Collins, Colorado, because he had not been able to wait the 12 steps to his front door. The letter informed him, in language that was professionally courteous and utterly final, that Pinnacle Systems had decided to pursue other candidates for the senior mechanical engineer position. They wished him well in his search. Marcus stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then he went inside, sat down at his kitchen table, and looked at the wall. He had interviewed at Pinnacle 4 times over 6 weeks. 4 rounds. He had redesigned their failing HVAC prototype in his own time between rounds 2 and 3, prepared a 40-slide presentation for round 4, and left that final interview believing, with the quiet confidence of a man who has learned to trust his own read of a room, that the job was his. He had been wrong, or not wrong exactly. He would learn later, much later, after it no longer mattered in the way it had on that Tuesday, that the decision had come down to him and the nephew of a board member, and that the nephew had not been asked to prepare a 40-slide presentation, and that the decision had been made before the final round of interviews began. But on that Tuesday, sitting at his kitchen table in Fort Collins, Marcus only knew 2 things: that he had given everything he had, and that it had not been enough. He was 31 years old. He had a master's degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Colorado, a decade of work that spanned 3 industries and 2 states, and a mind that operated in the particular register of people who see mechanical systems the way musicians hear music. Not just the notes, but the space between them. Not just the machine, but the logic underneath it. He had patents pending on 2 innovations he'd developed on his own time. He had been passed over for the same reasons his entire career: too direct in his assessments, too unwilling to perform the kind of enthusiasm that hiring managers found reassuring, too visibly certain of his own competence in environments that rewarded a more deferential presentation. He had been told, in various formulations, that he needed to work on his executive presence. He had been told he was technically brilliant, but perhaps not the right cultural fit. He had been told so many diplomatic variations of the same thing, that his competence was visible and his confidence was a problem, that he had begun to wonder if the problem was real. That Tuesday in March, he decided to stop wondering. He took out a legal pad and he wrote at the top, "If they will not make room for me, I will build the room." It was not a plan yet. It was something closer to a decision, the kind that comes before planning, that clears the ground. Marcus had always been methodical. He understood that emotion and analysis were not enemies. They were sequential. You allowed yourself the emotion first, fully, and then you moved into the analysis, and then you built. He allowed himself 3 days. On day 1, he was simply angry. On day 2, he slept too much and ate poorly and watched 2 seasons of a wildlife documentary and did not think about engineering at all. On day 3, he sat back down at the kitchen table with fresh paper and he began. Marcus had spent 2 years watching a particular problem in the industrial cooling sector, a problem he understood in precise technical detail, and that he believed, based on research he'd done in his off hours, was worth approximately $40 million a year in waste and inefficiency across the industry. He had tried to address it from the inside, through the companies he'd worked for and the companies he'd interviewed with. Nobody had wanted to hear it from someone at his level. He decided to address it from the outside. He spent 3 months writing a business plan. Not a pitch deck, a real plan, the kind with engineering specifications and cost models and market analysis, and a phased development timeline that he'd built from first principles. He called it ClearFlow Systems. He had a modest amount of savings. He had 2 former colleagues who believed in him and were willing to invest small amounts from their own limited resources. He had a patent application that was close to approval and that formed the core of his technical differentiation. He did not have enough money. He did not have connections in the venture capital world. He had never done any of this before. He started anyway. The first 6 months were what he would later call, with the economy of description that characterized his speech, instructive. He burned through his savings faster than projected. The patent approval was delayed twice. One of his 2 small investors had a family emergency and needed his money back. Marcus took consulting work at night to supplement, which meant he was working 18-hour days, which meant he was running on 4 hours of sleep and the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided, at a foundational level, that there is no alternative. He lived alone. He had always been better at solitude than at performance, at the quiet, sustained work of solving hard problems than at the social architecture of building a network. This had been his liability in job searches. It became his asset in a garage in Fort Collins, where there were no hiring managers to impress, and the only thing that mattered was whether the engineering was right. In month 7, the patent came through. In month 8, a small industrial manufacturer in Colorado Springs agreed to test his prototype. The test took 3 weeks. The results were better than his models had predicted. The manufacturer signed a development agreement. In month 10, Marcus drove to Denver and sat in a meeting with a regional industrial investment firm and presented his plan. They asked sharp questions. He gave sharp answers. At the end of 90 minutes, the partner leading the meeting said, "You've been living inside this problem for 2 years. It shows." They offered him a seed round that was 4 times larger than he'd asked for. He drove back to Fort Collins in the dark in February on I-25, with the mountains invisible to the west because of the weather and visible only in his mind. The way you know a thing is there even when you can't see it. And he thought about the letter from Pinnacle Systems, and he thought about the Tuesday in March, and he thought about the legal pad, and the decision he'd written at the top. He had built the room. Now the room was real. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening to this story from. If HeartLine Stories has moved you today, please like, subscribe, and share this channel. Every subscriber tells us to keep bringing stories like this. Now, back to Marcus. The next 12 months were different in quality from the first 12. Not easier, different. He had resources now, and resources changed the texture of difficulty without eliminating it. He hired 2 engineers, both excellent, both young, both willing to take below-market salaries in exchange for equity in something they believed was real. He expanded the prototype. He signed 2 more manufacturer agreements. He built a revenue model that, for the first time, showed a path to profitability that was not theoretical. Clearflow Systems was becoming a company. It was during this period, 14 months after the letter on a Thursday morning, that Marcus received a call from a number he didn't recognize. The area code was local. He answered. The voice on the other end introduced itself as belonging to someone at Pinnacle Systems. Not HR. Not a recruiter. The chief technology officer, a woman named Helen Park, who said she had heard about Clearflow through the industrial investment community and that she would like to have a conversation. Marcus held the phone for a moment. "What kind of conversation?" he said. Helen was direct, a quality Marcus had always respected and rarely encountered. "Pinnacle has a problem in the same sector you're addressing," she said. "We've been trying to solve it internally for 2 years. I read your patent application 6 months ago before I knew who you were. Last week someone mentioned your name in a meeting, and I put 2 and 2 together." A pause. "I understand you interviewed with us." 14 months ago, Marcus said. "I know, I've seen the notes." Another pause, longer. "I owe you an apology on behalf of this company, Mr. Webb. You were the right candidate. The process failed you. I would rather say that directly than pretend it didn't happen." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He had not expected this. Had not, in his most honest private moments, imagined that anyone at Pinnacle Systems would ever say these words to him. He had made his peace with the rejection not by forgiving it, but by rendering it irrelevant, by building something that made the outcome of that Tuesday matter less. But an apology, offered plainly and without excuse, was something different, something that landed differently. "I appreciate that," he said, and meant it. "I'd like to explore a partnership," Helen said, "between Clearflow and Pinnacle, and potentially something larger. Would you be open to a meeting?" The meeting happened the following week, in Pinnacle's conference room on the 14th floor of their building in Denver. Marcus arrived in the same suit he'd worn to the fourth-round interview, which fit him differently now. Not because he'd changed in size, but because he'd changed in orientation. He had sat in this building as a candidate. He was sitting in it now as something else. Helen Park was sharp and prepared, and she didn't waste his time with pleasantries which he liked. She walked him through Pinnacle's internal work on the cooling efficiency problem. He walked her through Clearflow's solutions. By the middle of the afternoon, the conversation had evolved past partnership into something her team was calling strategic acquisition. Marcus listened. He asked questions. He took his time. At one point, the CEO of Pinnacle, a man named Douglas Farron who had been in the room since 2 o'clock, looked across the table at Marcus and said, "I'll be honest with you. When Helen told me the story, I looked up the interview notes from 14 months ago. The evaluations were strong across the board. I want you to know that the outcome of that process was not a reflection of your qualifications." "I know that now," Marcus said. "Did you know it then?" A pause. "I suspected it," Marcus said, "but suspecting and knowing are different things. It took a while to know." Douglas nodded slowly. "What did you do with the in-between time?" Marcus looked at him steadily. "I built Clearflow." The acquisition was completed 4 months later. The terms were complex and the negotiations were real, and there were moments that were genuinely difficult, as all meaningful things are. But the final number, the number that represented what Clearflow Systems, built in a Fort Collins garage by a man who had been rejected for a job he deserved, was worth to Pinnacle Systems, was a number that Marcus did not share publicly, and that made his savings account look like a different kind of document than it had been on the Tuesday in March. He joined Pinnacle's leadership team as Director of Engineering Innovation. He kept the 2 engineers who had joined Clearflow early on. He had negotiated that specifically, quietly, as a condition he never made a show of but would not have bent on. They came with him. On his first day in the building, his actual first day, with a badge that said his name and a title that reflected what he had built, he walked past the conference room where his fourth-round interview had taken place. The room was empty. Afternoon light was coming through the windows at an angle that made the table glow a dull gold. He did not stop. He was not a man who lingered in the rooms of his old grievances. But he noted the room, the way you note a landmark you've passed before, not with sentiment, but with the particular quiet recognition of someone who understands where they've been and where they are now. The distance between those 2 things was 12 months, and a garage and a patent and a manufacturer in Colorado Springs, and a meeting on I-25 in the dark, and the specific stubbornness of a man who had decided, on a Tuesday in March, that if the room would not make space for him, he would build one. He walked down the hall to his new office. He had work to do. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the door they close on you might just be the wall of the room you're meant to build, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have a story of your own, write to us at heartlinestories4d@gmail.com. Every heart has a story worth telling. This is HeartLine Stories, where yours matters.